The year is 494 BCE. In the suffocating darkness of a Persian palace chamber, a young Greek woman presses her palm against cold marble, feeling the stone absorb her tears. Her wrists bear the marks of bronze shackles, but it's not the physical restraints that have broken her. It's the knowledge of what awaits at dawn. This is not a story of soldiers dying on battlefields. This is something far more insidious, a calculated cruelty that Darius I, King of Kings, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, designed specifically to destroy not just bodies, but souls, identities, entire lineages of memory. History recorded the fall of Miletus. Scrolls documented the battles, the sieges, the military strategies. But there's a chapter that was deliberately obscured, written in whispers by those who survived, hidden in fragments of pottery and desperate letters that archaeologists would only discover millennia later. What Darius imposed on Greek concubines wasn't merely slavery. It was systematic erasure, a punishment so methodical that it was designed to leave no trace, no memory, no legacy. Join us as we uncover a truth that empires tried to bury, a story of women whose names were stolen, but whose defiance echoed through centuries. This is the hidden history that powerful men wanted forgotten. But forgotten stories have a way of surfacing, carved into stone, pressed into clay, written in acts of quiet resistance that no king could completely erase. WY 494 BCE. The Persian Empire under Darius I stretched across 3 continents, commanding the destinies of millions. It was the superpower of the ancient world, unprecedented in scale, wealth, and military might. But even empires built on conquest feared one thing above all: rebellion. And the Greek city-states along the Ionian coast, prosperous, independent, fiercely proud of their Hellenic heritage, had committed the ultimate act of defiance. The Ionian Revolt of 499 to 494 BCE wasn't just a military uprising. It was a rejection of everything the Persian Empire represented: absolute monarchy, cultural homogenization, the subjugation of individual city-states to distant imperial authority. These Greeks had tasted Persian rule and found it suffocating. They burned the Persian satrap's palace in Sardis, rallied other cities, and for 5 years they fought for autonomy. But empires don't forgive. In 494 BCE, at the Battle of Lade, the Persian fleet crushed the Greek navy. Miletus, the beating heart of the rebellion, was next. What followed was not merely conquest. It was a message written in blood and ash, a warning to anyone who dared challenge Darius. The men of Miletus were slaughtered or enslaved. The city was razed, its temples desecrated, its treasures plundered. But for the women, particularly the young, the beautiful, those from noble families, Darius had designed something more calculated than death. He understood that to truly break a people, you must erase their future, contaminate their bloodlines, destroy their ability to remember who they were. The women of Miletus, and those of other rebellious Greek cities, were about to become instruments of a punishment that transcended individual suffering and entered the realm of cultural annihilation. Her name was Chrysis, though history wouldn't preserve it. We know her only from a fragment of correspondence found in Babylon, a letter that should never have survived. She was 19 when Miletus fell, daughter of a merchant family prosperous enough to own 2 ships, educated enough to read Homer, betrothed to a young man who would die on the walls defending their city. In another timeline, she would have married, raised children who spoke Greek, taught them about Hesiod and Sappho, maintained the cultural continuity that defined Hellenic identity. Beside her in that palace chamber was Milena, only 16, whose entire family had been killed in the siege. Milena had watched her father die defending their home, had held her mother as she bled out from a Persian arrow. The trauma had stolen her voice. She hadn't spoken since that day, but her eyes held something fiercer than words, an absolute refusal to forget. There were dozens of others. Ianthe, who had been a priestess of Artemis, her sacred vows now meaningless to her captors. Thais, who sang songs of home when the darkness became too heavy. Callista, whose nobility of birth meant nothing except that Darius wanted her degradation to be more symbolically complete. They were not soldiers, not warriors trained for battle. They were daughters, sisters, mothers-to-be, whose only crime was being born Greek in a city that dared to resist. And then there was the man who orchestrated their fate, Darius I, whom the Persians called Daryavahis, he who holds firm the good. 46 years old, ruler of an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to Macedonia, architect of an administrative system so sophisticated it would influence governance for millennia. History would remember him as Darius the Great, builder of Persepolis, codifier of laws, patron of infrastructure. But greatness and cruelty are not opposites. They often share the same throne. Darius didn't hate these women personally. That would have required seeing them as individuals. To him, they were variables in an equation, tools to solve the problem of rebellion. His punishment was mathematical in its precision. Remove Greek men from the equation, transplant Greek women far from their homeland, ensure their children would be Persian in language, culture, loyalty. Within 2 generations, Miletus would exist only in Persian records as a cautionary tale. The punishment began with geography. Darius didn't keep the Greek women in nearby satrapies where they might hear their language, maintain connections to their culture, or escape back to Greek-speaking territories. Instead, they were transported to Susa, nearly 1,500 miles from Miletus, a journey of months through foreign lands speaking incomprehensible languages. Each mile was designed to increase psychological distance from home, to make the thought of return not just impossible but unimaginable. But distance was only the first layer of the punishment. Upon arrival in Susa, the women faced a process of systematic dehellenization. Their Greek names were replaced with Persian ones. Chrysis became Artaxoster. Milena became Hadassah. The very sounds of their identities were erased, their names, which in Greek culture connected them to gods, ancestors, city-states, replaced with words that meant nothing to them, that held no memory. Their language was forbidden. Any woman heard speaking Greek faced immediate punishment. Reduced rations, isolation, in severe cases, physical beatings. Children born from these unions, and children were the entire point, would never hear Greek spoken. They would be raised in Persian, taught Persian customs, worship Persian gods, know nothing of Homer or Sophocles or the democratic assemblies of their mother's homeland. But even this wasn't the worst of it. Darius implemented a policy that struck at the very heart of Greek identity. These women would become concubines, but never wives. In Persian law, children of legitimate wives had rights, inheritance, status. Children of concubines, especially those from conquered, rebellious peoples, occupied a legal gray zone. They could be acknowledged or discarded at their father's whim. They had no claim to family names, to property, to the social structures that gave life meaning and continuity. More insidious still, the women were deliberately distributed among Persian nobility, military commanders, and administrators who had no personal connection to the Ionian campaigns. These men hadn't fought at Lade, hadn't stormed Miletus. To them, these Greek women were simply gifts from their king, exotic trophies, their histories irrelevant. The systematic nature of this distribution meant no concentration of Greek women in one location. No community where they might preserve their culture collectively. Chrysis found herself in the household of a Persian cavalry commander who had never been west of Babylon. He was not cruel by temperament. He simply saw her as property, valuable property to be maintained, but property nonetheless. He had a Persian wife who treated Chrysis with cold disdain, and 3 children who looked at her with curiosity, as one might regard an unusual petit night. When the household slept, some women engaged in the only resistance available to them, memory. Chrysis would whisper Homeric verses to herself, testing whether she could still remember. Milena, still silent by day, would hum Greek melodies so quietly only she could hear. Ianthe, in a different household miles away, scratched the Greek alphabet into the dirt of a courtyard garden, erasing it before dawn, redrawing it the next night, a ritual of remembrance against the tide of forgetting. But children inevitably came. This was the design, the final cruelty of Darius's punishment. Each pregnancy was a moment of profound psychological conflict. The child was both a piece of the mother and a tool of her erasure. To love this child was natural, human, unavoidable. But to love this child was also to participate in the destruction of her own people, to raise a son or daughter who would be Persian, who would possibly never know their mother was Greek, who might someday serve the very empire that had destroyed their mother's world. 5 years passed, then 10. The sharp edges of grief dulled into chronic ache. Some women broke entirely, retreating into silence or madness, their spirits extinguished by the relentless erosion of hope. Others adapted with a pragmatism born of survival, learning to find small joys, a kind word from a child, the bloom of a familiar flower that grew in both Greece and Persia, the rare gift of a moment alone. But a few, a determined few, transformed their cage into something else. They realized that while they couldn't return to Greece, couldn't restore what was lost, they could leave marks, signals to a future that might someday care. They became archivists of the forbidden, curators of endangered memory. Chrysis began to teach her daughter, whom the household called Miletus, Persian stories at bedtime. But the story of a queen who defied a tyrannical king was actually Antigone. The tale of a clever wanderer overcoming obstacles was Odysseus. The names were changed, the details modified, but the moral architecture of Greek literature was being transmitted in code. Hidden in plain sight, Milena, who hadn't spoken since the fall of Miletus, found a different voice. She had been placed in a household that maintained a small shrine, and she was tasked with its care. Over years, she gradually introduced decorative elements. Stones arranged in patterns that, from above, formed Greek letters. Persian prayers that, when you knew the code, contained lines from Sappho. The layout of oil lamps that mimicked the constellations as seen from Miletus 482 BCE. 12 years after the fall of Miletus, something remarkable happened. A letter arrived in Babylon from Susa, a rare piece of correspondence that somehow survived in the archaeological record, pressed into a clay tablet that would spend 2,500 years underground before being unearthed by archaeologists in the 20th century. The letter was written in Persian, officially reporting routine administrative matters. But encoded in the letter, using the first letters of specific words, was a message in Greek. We remember. We endure. Lux in tenebris lucet. Light shines in darkness. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the empire, in scattered households, other Greek women were discovering similar methods of resistance. A woman in Persepolis trained her son, whom everyone believed to be purely Persian, to recognize a specific sequence of hand gestures, a gestural alphabet that allowed silent communication of forbidden Greek words. Another in Ecbatana created a recipe for bread that, when the loaves were arranged in a specific order, told a story from the Iliad. These were not grand gestures. They would not overthrow empires or change policies. Most would fail, the messages lost, the codes forgotten. But they represented something Darius's systematization couldn't account for. The irrational, inefficient, absolutely human refusal to disappear. In 1956, French archaeologists working in Susa made a discovery that would take decades to fully understand. Beneath the foundations of what had been a Persian administrative building, they found a small hidden chamber, no more than 4 feet square. Inside were objects that shouldn't have existed in that location. Fragments of Greek pottery, a small bronze statue of Athena, a woman's hair comb with Greek decorative patterns, and most remarkably, a collection of small clay tablets with Greek text. The tablets told stories, fragments of Homer, lines from Sappho, names, names of Greek cities and families. One tablet contained a list: Chrysis, daughter of Callias of Miletus; Melena, daughter of Timotheos of Miletus; Ianthe, priestess of Artemis. 27 names. 27 women who refused to be erased. The carbon dating suggested these tablets were created around 480 BCE, approximately 14 years after the fall of Miletus. The women would have been in their 30s and 40s by then, some with teenage children who spoke no Greek. They somehow managed to be in the same place at the same time, perhaps during the funeral of a high-ranking Persian official, and in that brief window they performed this act of memorial. But the most profound discovery came from DNA analysis of remains found in the same archaeological layer, combined with forensic genealogical work. Some of the Persian families in the region carried distinct genetic markers indicating Greek ancestry, specifically from Ionian populations. The women's children had survived. Their descendants, unknowing carriers of Greek heritage, had continued for generations as Persians, exactly as Darius had planned. Yet something else had survived too. A small community in the region maintained an unusual tradition. During certain festivals, women would perform a ritual that Persian scholars had long considered a local variation of Persian practice. But anthropologists studying the ritual in the 1990s noticed something. The movements, the chant's rhythm, the symbolic gestures aligned not with Persian traditions, but with ancient Greek religious practices associated with Artemis worship. Somehow, through centuries in fragmentary form, elements of Greek culture had persisted, transformed beyond recognition but not entirely extinguished. Ianthe, the former priestess, had found a way. Unable to practice her rites openly, she had taught them to her daughters as family traditions, which her daughters taught to their daughters, the original meaning fading but the form preserved, like a message in a bottle that takes centuries to arrive, altered by the journey but still recognizable to those who know what to look for. We don't know exactly when Chrysis died, or Melena, or the others. Persian records didn't consider them important enough to document beyond their initial assignment. They likely died as most people do. Not dramatically, but quietly, their passing noted only by those who loved them. Their graves, if marked at all, bore Persian names. Their children mourned them as Persian mothers. The systematic erasure that Darius designed largely succeeded. And yet there are those tablets in Susa, those encoded messages, those ritual gestures passed down through generations. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 60 years after the fall of Miletus, recorded that Athenians wept during a theatrical performance about the city's destruction. The entire audience, overcome with collective grief. The playwright was fined for making the citizens remember something too painful. But they remembered. Despite everything, they remembered. The Roman poet Ovid, centuries later, would write, Tempora mutantur, nociti mutamer in illis. Times change and we change with them. But he also wrote that some changes are death by another name, the slow erasure of who we were. The women of Miletus changed. They had to change to survive. But in their changing, they kept fragments, embers that refused to be fully extinguished. Today, in museums across the world, you can see artifacts from this period. A Greek-style vase found in Persia with a Persian inscription, a Persian textile with Greek geometric patterns, a child's toy that blends design elements from both cultures. Each object is a small testament to cultural contact, to resistance, to the impossibility of complete erasure. Modern genetic studies of populations in ancient Susiana region reveal that approximately 3 to 4% carry genetic markers consistent with Aegean Greek ancestry dating to the 5th century BCE. These are likely the descendants of women like Chrysis and Melena. They are Iranians with no memory of Greece, no connection to Hellenic culture, yet carrying in their very DNA the evidence of a story that was meant to be forgotten. What Darius imposed on Greek concubines was worse than death because it was death without end. A living erasure, a transformation of identity so complete that the victims would raise children who became the instruments of their culture's extinction. It was cruelty made systematic, industrialized before industry existed, a punishment designed to echo through generations. But it was also incomplete, because human beings, it turns out, are terribly bad at being erased. We leave marks, intentional and accidental. We encode resistance in recipes and rituals, in the tilt of a letter, in the arrangement of stones. We whisper to our children, and sometimes those whispers survive, transformed into something else but still carrying an echo of the original voice. The tablets buried in Susa contain this line, written by an unknown hand, Omicron Lambda Sigma Mu Epsilon Theta Alpha. We will not be forgotten. It was written in defiance, in hope, in the face of everything that should have ensured oblivion. And here we are, 2,500 years later, speaking their names, telling their stories, proving their defiance was not in vain. These women, Chrysis, Milena, Ianthe, Thais, Callista, and the 22 others whose names survived on those clay tablets, and the countless more whose names didn't, deserve to be remembered not as victims frozen in their trauma, but as individuals who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, who found ways to resist within the constraints of absolute powerlessness. Their story is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. Today, across the world, there are still communities facing cultural erasure, languages being lost, identities being systematically dismantled. The specific mechanisms change. No modern empire is literally kidnapping women to transform their bloodlines, but the impulse to erase, to homogenize, to make everyone forget who they were, remains disturbingly contemporary. If the story moved you, if you believe that forgotten voices deserve to be heard and erased histories deserve to be recovered, join us in this work. Subscribe to this channel to support our mission of uncovering the stories that powerful institutions wanted buried. Each view, each share, each comment contributes to keeping these memories alive. You become part of the chain of remembrance that stretches back to those women pressing their names into clay in 480 BCE. Hit the like button if you want more stories like this. Not just military history or the deeds of kings, but the hidden histories of ordinary people facing extraordinary injustice. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload, because we're committed to releasing these recovered stories regularly, giving voice to the systematically silenced. And please share this video. One of the cruelest aspects of what Darius did was isolating these women, preventing them from forming community, from sharing their stories even with each other. You can do what they couldn't. Connect people across distance, create community around shared knowledge, ensure that their story reaches others who need to hear it.